Welcome to Church of the Ascension in Gloucester City for the second of 5 forums for our bishop candidates. Before we begin, I would like to start with prayer. This is a prayer that we have asked you all to pray for during this search process. It was written by the Reverend Dr. Mauricio, who is standing right back here in the purple sweater. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God of all, hold the Diocese of New Jersey in the palm of your hand during this time of discernment. Help us to come together as sisters and brothers of Jesus Christ, listening to one another with open hearts and open minds. Enter into our conversations and make them holy, and lead us into a peaceful place of unity as we search for our new bishop. Amen. I am the Reverend Jeffrey Roy. I am rector of St. George's by the River in Rumson, New Jersey, and I am also chair of the Diocesan Transition Committee for the 13th Bishop of New Jersey. And so on behalf of that committee, I want to welcome you here to this meet and greet forum with our candidates. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and with our candidates for the next Bishop of New Jersey. I want to particularly thank everyone here at Ascension for their hospitality this afternoon. A few comments about the format. So we will be giving each of the candidates an opportunity to introduce themselves and to answer questions that were submitted ahead of time on the Transition website. These questions were submitted by clergy and lay people of the diocese and represented a wide range of topics. Excuse me, I also want to say here at the outset that the candidates have not been given the specific questions we are asking today ahead of time. What they have been given was the raw list of all the questions submitted on the website, and that totaled 67 questions so far. We felt, to be fair, they should at least have an understanding of the topics that we feel, we being the collective we, all of us in the diocese, that are important to our future as a diocese and to the Episcopal Church in general. Throughout all of the forums, the candidates will be answering their questions individually. That is, we will lead a candidate in who will answer 5 questions, and then there will be a trade-off as the next candidate comes out. The other candidates will be sequestered in the office and will not have heard the questions ahead of time. So the first time that they have an experience of the questions is when I ask when they come out here. The order in which the candidates are presenting was determined entirely by random at dinner on Monday night. In the interest of time, there will be no questions taken from the floor. However, following this forum, 30 minutes have been set aside for you to meet and greet the candidates one-on-one. And additionally, at the end of the service, at the end of the forum, we have cards up here. If you would like some follow-up information, or if you have a question you would like us to consider inserting in a later forum, we ask you to fill that out and to do so and hand it to either myself or Valerie Balling. And with that, let's begin. Our first candidate up is the Reverend Canon Dr. Sally French, who currently serves as a canon for regional ministry and collaborative innovation in the Diocese of North Carolina.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I know I'm about to get a question, but before I do that, I just want to thank you all for being here today, either in person or online, for taking time out of your busy days to be with us as we walk through this journey. I realize as the first person going, I'm either going to be the memorable person or the one that you can't remember at the end of it all. But I'm really glad to be here. So.
Thank you. For the first question is, tell about a time when you have explored the missional opportunities and challenges in the communities you have served. How have you been able to leverage parish strengths to engage with and shape missional presence in the wider community?
Thank you. That wasn't one of the questions on the list. But I actually feel like in some ways that question was written for me, so I'm grateful for it. I serve on the bishop's staff in the Diocese of North Carolina, and much of my work, I've been in that job since 2020. Before that, I was in parish ministry for almost 20 years. Much of my current role involves connecting with congregations and helping them to see the possibilities that God has in store for them in the midst of their community and in the places where they are situated. God is already at work in the cities and towns and communities where our churches serve and minister and witness, but sometimes congregations have a hard time getting outside of their own doors, especially as congregations grow smaller over the years and perhaps as communities get a little bit older. So a lot of the work that I do day to day is engaging congregations in conversations about what it might look like to think beyond themselves. Let me tell you about a recent example just a couple of months ago. I was working with a vestry in one of our mid-sized congregations, so large enough to have a full-time rector, but not large enough to have all of the things that you might hope for. And they were about to begin we ask that congregations have a mutual ministry review. It's not a staff review of the rector, but simply an opportunity for the vestry and the clergy to come together to talk about the mission and ministry of the church. And the first question that they had was, why can't we seem to bring children into our church community? Now, this is a small church in a relatively rural area of North Carolina, but in an area that surprisingly is growing because there's a lake there. It's a fairly famous lake, Lake Gaston. And is it Lake Gaston? I'm going to ask my husband, Clark, who's over there. That lake that's in the north, it is Lake Gaston. Okay, excellent. You know the congregation I'm talking about. And it's got a lot of lakeside properties. And in the pandemic, what we discovered was that people were moving to rural North Carolina lake houses in order to work from home, and that there was a growing population of empty nesters, folks who'd been able to move because the kids were away at college or had left. And this congregation that I was working with had recognized the people moving into the community, but hadn't been able to figure out how they might be able to respond because they were so focused on children's ministries. What if we improve our Sunday school offerings that no one's coming to? What if we create better Sunday church worship bags for children? You know those things? They kind of had to dust them off a little bit and put in fresh crayons. And it was only in discovering through the conversations and in asking people to go into the communities around to explore where God might actually be calling them that we could see that this congregation could begin to see that the missional opportunity in front of them wasn't to reach out to the demographic that they had reached out to 30 or 40 years ago, but instead to reach out to those same folks who are now in empty nest stage and living within a few miles of the church. People who were looking for new community because they were new to the area and who were able then to connect and begin the process of joining the church. That has transformed, in many ways, the life of this small congregation. And this is only a few months back. It's already made a difference in how the folks that turned up for their welcome back barbecue, big thing in North Carolina, the folks that have been gathering, the newcomers that have been coming through, their most recent ministry project was an art gallery that brought in a number of those people. So by listening to the community, by working with what was there and discerning and praying together and trying to find God's call, that's a great example of finding the missional opportunities. That is one of many because that's the work that I do in North Carolina. So I'm excited to share that with you.
Thank you. We have several members of the LGBTQIA+ community in our diocese. Can you tell us about your work with these communities and what is your commitment to queer advocacy?
Thank you. Only several?
Well, this was submitted. I am not editing.
I appreciate the question, and I really do. I think so. I served most recently. My most recent congregation was one that had a deep connection to the LGBTQ community in downtown Durham, St. Philip's in downtown Durham, North Carolina, and that was the congregation that was one of the first churches in the Episcopal Church to offer two men the opportunity to be married in the church on the day that that became legally possible. There was a long history of that kind of witness and advocacy in the community. So that's something that I joined in joyfully. It was not something I created because those connections predate me, not by years, but by decades. But it was a wonderful opportunity to celebrate with people, to connect, and to ensure and invite the fullness of God's children into the leadership, lay leadership and clergy of the church there. So that is one of the places where I've served and supported that work. The other thing that I do right now, though, is I support small congregations. I support congregations of all sizes, and I support clergy, some of whom are retired or bivocational, who are looking for opportunities to connect. I'm not our transition person. We have a canon who does that work. But I certainly work with folks who are coming into the diocese and looking for ways to be able to offer their gifts and service and ministry in congregations. And that's actually a wonderful place, a wonderful opportunity to try and find the right fit in church communities that are, in some cases, that having LGBTQ clergy lead them is a new thing. We'll be finding opportunities to advance and advocate for people who might not have been considered as part of the ministry team in those communities. And so that's something I love to do, because it's about testing out where a congregation might be and inviting them to take a small step forward in having someone come and be with them that they might not have previously considered an opportunity, a person who they would consider for leadership.
What new and hopeful perspectives and ideas can you bring to the conversation about church decline that support and encourage long-term solutions?
That's a really important question, and I'm glad you asked that. We have a number of things right now that we know of in the Episcopal Church that help congregations to get more connected, to begin to, if not to grow, then certainly to avoid some of the decline. There is some great work in congregational development. The College for Congregational Development does good work. There is, the engaging in our neighborhoods processes that can be undertaken. There are ways to connect and engage and support congregational vitality. I know a few things about that. The first is that when a church is connected in worship and there is a robust life of prayer for the congregation, then it is a healthier congregation. The next is that a church that is focused only on themselves, that lives only for themselves, will struggle to grow. And so a church has to be connected to the community around and responsive to the needs of the world and outside of the church doors. We know that when those things are in place, there are things that we can do to work with a congregation to help them to engage. But one thing that I think is really important in this conversation, and it goes back to the words of St. Paul, and I'm going to forget my Bible quote exactly, but I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth, right? It's not up to us to save the church. It's up to us to build vibrant and vital communities of faith where people can live out their gospel call, where people can live out their baptismal covenant in relationship with one another in service to the world around. If we are faithful, if we respond to God's call to us, then by the grace of God, God gives the growth, and there is hope and possibility and opportunity before us. Friends, I think that is very good news, because if it's up to me to save the church, or up to you, or even up to all of us together, I'm not sure. But if it's up to God, and we can partner with God and be friends with God and work with God's people, then by the grace of God, anything is possible.
Communication is essential to effective ministry. However, it has been difficult to access clear and prompt avenues of communication, particularly with diocesan staff. Emails often go unanswered and resources are tough to access. How would you remedy this communication disconnect and work to establish a diocesan culture of prompt and effective response?
I answer my emails, I answer my phone calls, and I answer my texts. And I do that in a way that is timely and responsive. And because of that, I'm able to build really good and trusting relationships with the clergy and lay leaders I serve. It is my hope and my expectation that if you were to call me as your next bishop, that would be a staff expectation across the board, and that would be a culture that we would build and encourage and support all the way. So you would have those communications happening through the most basic interpersonal level. I also think you have a wonderful, Steve here has been with us. This is the second day of live stream and technology support. And we've got some wonderful opportunities to use technology to support and enhance communications. I know some of what you're already doing. I don't know all of it, and I am eager to learn more. But I wonder what it might be like to have a conversation about what is needed and what is appropriate to the context of the Diocese of New Jersey. I wonder what it might be like to develop the communications tools and resources that actually work for you right now, where you are, in your congregations and communities, and for the wider world. If we're not sharing the good news of what we're doing together with one another, then how can we share it with the community around?
We live in a time of great change and transformation as a diocese, with over half of the parishes in our community facing a 5-year window, at the end of which they will not be able to afford full-time clergy. What is your vision for the transformation of our congregational and clergy models of work, witness, and ministry?
Can you read the last part again, the congregational and...
What is your vision for the transformation of our congregational and clergy models of work, witness, and ministry?
I love that. Thank you. Work, witness, and ministry. The 5-year timeline is a concerning number, and it is especially concerning, I think, to the congregations that know that the current model is not sustainable, and I think to clergy who are working in places where they may not be employed in 5 or 7 or 10 years. I think it's also perhaps concerning to our retired clergy who often carry the weight of those ministries when full-time clergy have stepped away. And I think that there's opportunities to, there's a couple of clergy in the third pew, very aware of that particular dynamic, yeah. So what I wonder about, I think you're all doing some amazing work already with your affiliations. And not just with the affiliations, but with the work that you've done to partner together around social justice, around outreach ministries and advocacy in the communities and in the different ways that, you know, we spent this morning touring 2 churches in Camden. We saw the food pantry at St. Wilfrid's, and we saw San Andreas, and we learned about the Camden Christmas program. Both of those are inspiring opportunities. They're places where people have connected beyond the congregation to offer ministry and witness and service. And that kind of work already in place is a great foundation, I think, for the possibility of connecting in affiliations and partnerships across the diocese. And not just in the patterns that have happened in the past, where it's for the most part been congregations of a similar size and type and geography. But I wonder what it looks like if we consider affiliations between a large congregation and a smaller one, where a congregation that might be able to afford a priest and a half might share half a priest, sorry, not literally, with a congregation that might only be able to afford a half-time position. I think there's interesting conversations around bivocational ministry that allow for an expansion of that, of those opportunities, recognizing that bivocational ministry sometimes reflects difficult circumstances for clergy and congregation, and knowing that when that happens, it's important not only to be clear about your intentions, but also your practices. When we can create a foundation for support of congregations, leadership, and clergy then there are opportunities to explore the partnerships and possibilities that will allow us to continue to sustain ministry and explore those kinds of possible partnerships and collaborations and affiliations that might even allow growth to begin in places where there has been no growth over recent years.
Thank you. I have one more question, but before, we're having some technical difficulties with our live stream. If at all possible, can you put your phones here on airplane mode to try? We're live streaming off of Verizon 5G, and so we think we're saturated the local tower. So if you could just for the next hour put them on, you get this many people in one place apparently. So we're going to see if we can get the stream back up live. Thank you for that interruption. Finally, can you share with us a specific artwork, that is a film, a book, a poem, a play, a painting, or a piece of music that inspires you? How does this work of art inform your spirituality or theology?
Ooh, yes. So, my children are now, my daughter will be 13 next month, and my son turned 17 just before Christmas. And when they were little, they both attended at separate times a preschool program near our house that did every Christmas and every spring as fundraisers. They would make these incredible works of art by getting, those bingo blotter things? Well, they got the full range of colors, and all of the students in the building would come in and they'd do their dots along this carefully crafted pattern. And so out of that, you get these incredible images. I remember one year it was about the size of that ultrafrontal, and it was fish in different patterns of fish and different shades of water, and it almost looked like modern fabric art. And it had been made by these kids who ranged in age between 2 and 5. And it was beautiful. And I remember my son going up and pointing to like 3 small dots near a fish's tail and saying, "See that? I did that." And I love that idea. I love the beauty of these images that come when we work together. And I love the way, I remember his expression as he took me over, sticky little fingers dragging me to see this thing and saying, that was the thing that I did for that. I love the image. I love the way that we can create beauty out of community that works together. I love the way that when we offer our best gifts, even a small piece can become part of something that is so much bigger. And I think that's a lot of how God works in our world, right? God invites us to participate not in doing the whole thing, but in working together to create something that is beautiful and profound and compelling. The other thing about that image is that, it being the preschool, they then printed it off in copies, and they, you could auction it off and buy it and all of that. So it was spread out in the world, and it was a good source of interest and connection for the school that had done it. So there's levels and layers of possibility when you have that kind of work and possibility. Do I have time to share one more piece of art?
Sure.
Okay, excellent. One of my favorite biblical stories is the Road to Emmaus. And there is this year in particular, as I've been walking through this discernment and feeling God's presence in it and seeing God's presence in you, there is a Ukrainian iconographer, so working right now in a war zone, who does these beautiful images. Her name is Ivanka Demchuk, and she's done one of the Emmaus Road that has, you can see it's 2 sort of vaguely, you can't tell if it's male or female or a husband and wife, or just a couple of figures encountering the risen Christ on the road, and their hearts are just on fire, ablaze as they walk this journey. And that image for me has been a powerful one in this conversation, this discernment with you, the idea of seeing where God is warming our hearts and setting us on fire for what could be and for the conversations that might follow. So thank you for this opportunity. I will continue to hold you in my prayers. I hope you will hold me and the other candidates in yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce the Reverend Dr. Mauricio Wilson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be with you.
Can you tell us about a time when you have explored the missional opportunities and challenges in the communities you have served? How were you able to leverage parish strengths to engage with and shape missional presence in the wider community?
Can you repeat that again?
Sure.
It's a long one. So
Yeah. Tell about a time when you have explored the missional opportunities and challenges in the communities you have served, and how were you able to leverage parish strengths to engage with and shape missional presence in the wider community?
So I have served for the last 13 years as rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Oakland. And before that, I was rector of All Saints Church in Great Neck, New York. Very different communities, very, very different communities. But the most important thing is that both of those communities have always been very grounded in what happens beyond the walls of the church. For example, St. Paul's in Oakland, currently, throughout the last 13 years, we developed a food pantry. And there was a great need among the senior communities that surround us. Seniors who could either pay a rent or pay for food. So we decided, with the leadership of our deacon, to start a food pantry. And currently, the food pantry continues to serve. It started serving 30 people a decade ago to 100 families now. And it was not just simply because we wanted to start a pantry, but we saw the need that emerged, and particularly over the last 3 years during the pandemic. When we were told you have to shut down, you can no longer distribute food, we said, no, people are still hungry. And it is even worse now. We have to find a way to make this happen. So we devised ways in which we started to, instead of allowing people to come into the building and shop for their groceries, we started packing bags and handing them out at the church's door. So we were restricted to 7 people at a time in the building, and so we had volunteers come in by groups of families of 4 or 5, do some work, then they would leave, then another group would come in, do some more work, and then on Sunday mornings, we would open up the doors of the church and just put a couple of bags at the top step, move away, and allow the persons who needed the food to come and take their bags and move on. So we leveraged our thoughts and ingenuity to find ways to make that ministry continue to happen as best we possibly could. St. Paul's also has a school. We have a K-8 school. And I have found that it is essential that the church be in good relationship with the school. When I got there, literally they were butting heads with each other. And at my first vestry meeting, one of my vestry people said to me, "What are we going to do about the school?" And I said, "Nothing except build relationship. We need to build relationship." And about 2 years after the NAES, National Association of Episcopal Schools biennial conference, asked the head of school and I to present on church and school relationships, because we had been a prime example of how 2 communities can come together and go over their differences, mend them, and move forward for the benefit of both the church, the school, and the wider community that always saw us as one. So that was one of those situations where now members of the school community see the church no longer as adversaries, but as partners. Just to go back just a little bit, in Great Neck, when All Saints started, was about 99% Christian. By the time I got there, it was about 95% Jewish. And so that means that apparently there wasn't much for us to do there, but we partnered with our Jewish colleagues in the area to do ministry to those who were not Jewish, who still lived in the community, but who were not connecting because they didn't know necessarily where they needed to go. So it was taking advantage of the connections that they had so that we together can minister to those who didn't know where else to go.
We have several members, and we were bickering about several. We have several members of the LGBTQIA plus community in our diocese. Tell us about your work with these communities. What is your commitment to queer advocacy?
Yeah, I think several is probably
Yeah. Just want you all to have the exact same question.
Yeah. So St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Oakland is an opening and welcoming community. Before I got there, even before I got there, it had already declared itself a member of Oasis, California, which is the LGBT ministry of our diocese. And the members of St. Paul's are really committed to this. So this was part of what I knew I was coming into from the very beginning. And so throughout my years there, my relationship, both with the LGBT community inside the church and beyond, has been very strong. We are unabashedly open to everyone. There is no one who is excluded from the life of our congregation. We have sponsored at least one transgender person for ordination, a couple of people who are identified as LGBTQ, and all around the spectrum of what all that means. And we continue to be the place where the only church in the Diocese of California that during the Pride Month flies the rainbow flag on our flagpole. There was a big argument about it among people who felt that we shouldn't do it and those who felt we should. That happened just before I got to St. Paul's, and it was called Flaggate. And so we had conversations about it, and at the end I said, I have to make the decision because it is sort of like a property thing. And I said, we will fly the Episcopal flag from July to May. And on June 1st, we'll fly the rainbow flag. And we started actually to have a ceremony for the rising of the flag on June 1st. But it is not only about the flag, it's about how we embrace the people of the parish. I have baptized so many children of LGBTQ families. We had our former organist, may he rest in peace. One of the last things we did for him while he was there was to actually have his wedding as part of the main morning service on Sunday. Wow. And their dog was the ring bearer. So we are committed. I'm committed to it. I am fully. I honestly don't feel like I want to spend any of my energy, time, or commitment to either judging or excluding anyone. I actually want to spend all the energy I can to find Christ present in those who are different than me. And it's not only the LGBTQ difference, whatever that may be. I think my energy, my ministry, my preaching is better spent finding Christ instead of shading Christ that may be present in another before me.
Thank you. What new and hopeful perspectives and ideas can you bring to the conversation about church decline that support and encourage long-term solutions?
I'm going to use one word. I've been thinking about this for a while. Discernment. I think that it is important that not only as individuals, but as communities of faith, that we take some time to discern. And discernment is something that should happen at many different stages of life. We need, think about this. Somebody else discerned for us when we were going to be born, where we were going to live, what we were going to eat, where we were going to go to school. And then it came to a point where we had to discern at about 18 or so what we were going to do with the rest of our lives. And as we, once we finished college or whatever it is we were doing, we had to discern where we were going to work, so on and so forth. As individuals, we spend our lives discerning. Why not do that as faith communities? Because the reality is that life changes. Our communities change. We should not wait for a moment of crisis to start to discern. I think it is important. I would like to invite congregations on a regular basis to stop and say, what is God calling us to today? And part of that is looking at what is different around us since the last time we did this. How has our community changed? How have the faces in the pews changed? Maybe what we used to do 5 years ago is no longer useful because the people in the pews have changed. Maybe what we were doing 20 years ago is no longer useful because our whole neighborhood has changed. How is God calling us to do something different? And I think that when we do that, we bring new life. We bring new life because we're no longer simply looking at what we used to do in the past. We're actually looking at what is God calling us to do next. And it keeps us refreshed. It keeps our eyes open. It keeps us always thinking, how do we move forward? What do we do next? And yes, I do know some of you may be thinking, yeah, but as individuals, we die. So discernment stops at that point. Well, yeah, maybe after 500 years, a church needs to close because there's an industrial plant right beside it. Or, being the Jersey Shore, you never know, one of these days, hopefully it doesn't happen for another 500 years, a hurricane may make all of this beach property, right? We don't know that. But until then, we need to do what needs to be done to keep looking forward, to keep looking for new ways to be who God is calling us to be.
Communication is essential to effective ministry. However, it has been difficult to access clear and prompt avenues of communication, particularly with diocesan staff. Emails go unanswered, and resources are tough to access. How would you remedy this communication disconnect and work to establish a diocesan culture of prompt and effective response?
I think this question has a lot of cultural issues embedded in it. Think about this. 50 years ago, if you wanted to talk to somebody, you couldn't just pick up a device and say, call Jeff, right? You have to, right? And wait. There was no such thing as an email. You either had to show up at the person's office or send them a letter. Things have shifted tremendously. And with that, have cultural expectations. And even worse, those changes happen even more rapidly now. Think about it. Every year, Apple puts out at least one new version of a phone that can do more than the previous one could do. It is a reality culturally that the speed at which people want to be in connection with each other today is speeding up a lot faster than we are able to keep up with the trend. So I think that one of the things we need to do is we need to streamline certain things. We do have websites. Every organization has a website. Is there a way of getting the major questions that people ask all the time in a page where people can go to the FAQs? To the FAQs, and if somebody says, as the priest Jeff, what is the diocese? You can go and, okay, there it is, right? There it is. Because the reality is that I have been on both sides of the issue of unanswered emails. Because literally right now, while I'm here, even though people know I am here, I still get about 50 emails a day. And they all expect me to answer right now. And when I get back home, there are those who are going to say, you didn't answer the email I sent you on Tuesday. I'm like, sorry, it's a little bit busy. Streamline certain things. Create clear expectations. Create clear expectations. And as much as we can, find the human and technological resources that will allow us to fill the gap in those other areas. And the other thing is, I think it is important for all of our members, everybody who is a part of the church, to be aware that there are some things that they're not going to get to know. That's, transparency can only go so far. I always tell people, when things happen, decisions that some of us as clergy have to make, people want to know, why did you do that? And I have to say, sorry, I can't tell you. What do you mean you can't tell me? I give my pledge to the church. I should be, sorry, I cannot tell you. No matter how angry you get, you cannot have this information. And so creating those clear parameters of expectations, taking advantage as much as we can of the possibilities of streamlining and putting information out there that just sits there all the time, and then You know, when you do get the email that is 10 pages long and you only have 5 minutes, hopefully we can find a way to just say, I'll get back to you 2 weeks from now. Yes.
Speaking of technology.
Yeah.
We live in a time of great change and transformation as a diocese, with over half of the parishes in our community facing a 5-year window, at the end of which they will not be able to afford full-time clergy. What is your vision for the transformation of our congregational
affiliate, in other words, groups of churches working on social justice. And I was part of something called the San Diego Rapid Response Network, myself as an individual, a clergy person. And we got a call that the Border Patrol was admitting people and then leaving them at the San Diego Greyhound bus station, which is not a good place to be late at night, and leaving them on the street. And these were mothers, sometimes fathers with very young children. So we quickly, that group, the San Diego Rapid Response Network, quickly mobilized. I received a text, can anybody who speaks Spanish come to the bus station and help? And all we were doing was sort of talking to people and giving them food, diapers, things like that. I was running off to a local 7-Eleven to grab whatever I could for young mothers and their children as they were trying to get on buses to Arizona or Texas or New York. I went back to my church because we were being asked if we could have a shelter. They needed places to stay. They needed to get oriented. They needed to talk to their families. They needed to talk to lawyers. And my vestry said, no, we can't do it because our parish hall, which is quite large, is used throughout the week for writing things. So then we got the second call. I got called by the executive director, and he said, could your church be a place of donation drop-off and sorting of clothing and food and other necessaries. So this time I went to the vestry gingerly, knowing that there were mixed feelings about this, and I said, could we do this? And they said, yes, we can do that. So every single Wednesday morning, we had tons of donations coming in from San Diego, and then monetary donations coming to me personally or our church from around the country. It was that broad, the effort. And people in the diocese heard that our church was doing something, and so we became the hub for the whole diocese to meet this need. And we did it for nearly a year. The shelter was someplace else. We would sort the clothing, get rid of the things that weren't, that you couldn't pass on, like bunny costumes. And then deliver them to the shelter, which was being run by a consortium of things. Eventually, we advocated for the County of San Diego to provide medical and mental health care because it was a public health crisis. Diseases were coming into San Diego among these poor children. It remains to this day, to me, a sign of how a church can mobilize very quickly when there is an unexpected and dire need in the community. But more importantly for me, this was the most important thing, that the people in my congregation who were politically divided became united. Because we weren't talking about the laws and how they were being administered. We were talking about meeting the needs of people who had arrived and who were being given an opportunity to seek asylum, and everybody saw the pressing need and forgot about the secular political issue and instead focused on the gospel issue of needing to provide aid to people who were in desperate need. And we also, as a result of that, our church became one of the organizing churches in this organization called the San Diego Organizing Project. I know it sounds more political, but it's actually a group of houses of faith, most of them Christian, a couple of synagogues, one mosque. And we, the clergy, work together and advocate for people. We advocated very successfully with the County Board of Supervisors to take an unused old county building that had been a courthouse and turn it into a multi-level shelter that had classrooms for children, places for medical care and legal care. And we eventually stopped it because it wasn't needed. The massive flow of people stopped. But during that time, it met a tremendous need, and I'm just so touched by the way my congregation responded.
We have several members of the LGBTQIA+ community in our diocese. Tell us about your work with these communities. What is your commitment to queer advocacy?
While I am not gay myself, I want to tell you the person I love most in life who is my godfather. And this was at a time when people kept that a secret because it could be dangerous to reveal it. And I figured it out when I was 17 because my godfather had a male roommate, and finally by age 17 it clicked with me that man was his partner. And I felt very touched by figuring that out, and also very sad that my godfather could not tell me about it. I was like his child. He always brought me Christmas and birthday presents. He called me kiddo. I was the closest he had to a child. And when I was at All Saints Pasadena, I was in charge of the same-sex marriages. That was part of the ministry as soon as it became legal in California in 2013. So it's been a significant part of my ministry, at least in Pasadena.
Thank you. Communication is essential to effective ministry. However, it has been difficult to access clear and prompt avenues of communication, particularly with diocesan staff. Emails go unanswered and resources are tough to access. How would you remedy this communication disconnect and work to establish a diocesan culture of prompt and effective response?
Well, the first thing I would do is that I think, having been a manager or director in the business environment, I could tell you that we should have the same objectives and goals for employees at the diocesan level that we have in other aspects of society. People should have a set of goals for their job, and one of the goals of that job is to serve the diocese. That all diocesan employees, including the bishop, have the job of serving the members of the diocese. And so I would make it a part of everybody's job description that they're to respond to inquiries within 24 hours. And that's a part of your performance. That's what you are measured on. In addition, I would make sure that communications were available in the prevalent languages of this diocese, which, English, Spanish, Haitian Creole, if possible, Igbo. And one of the things I've learned about communication in my job as a rector is that if you think you're communicating well, you probably need to be doing 3 times more than you thought. Now, I'm sure a lot of you can sympathize with the rector who hears from somebody, how come you never told us about the visiting preacher? I'm like, but it's been in the newsletter and the announcements for the past 5 weeks and on the website, and we tweeted it. So there's nothing you can do if nobody's paying attention. But in general, we fail at thinking, if I've said it once, I've said it enough. But in pedagogy, what we're taught as teachers is that you have to teach something 7 times. So I would say God gave us 7 days, communicate it 7 times, 7 different ways. Different generations access information differently. Print, Twitter, video, podcasts. And so what we need to do is leverage it in as many ways as we can. And I would say make sure that you have a communications person at each a church and mission as well, so that there are people responsible for passing on the information.
Thank you. We live in a time of great change and transformation as a diocese, with over half of the parishes in our community facing a 5-year window, at the end of which they will not be able to afford full-time clergy. What is your vision for the transformation of our congregational and clergy models of work, witness, and ministry?
Well, I want to say that it's not just whether you can afford a full-time rector, but it's also whether the land that your church is standing on is not going to be underwater in 10 to 15 years. That's the other thing that New Jersey and other communities are facing. Already the churches on the barrier islands are getting flooded regularly, and homes may be flooded regularly. So I think the other thing we need to do is look farther than 5 years out and look at what's happening there. I think there are great opportunities for collaboration between churches that are geographically somewhat close to one another. One of the great advantages of small churches is that people have a tight community, have a very good sense of their identity, and hopefully a very good sense of their neighborhood. And so what I would do is seek affinities between neighboring congregations, and they might not just be Episcopal congregations, but other congregations, and look for ways that we could partner in ministry. This is particularly important when it comes to youth ministry, because what children want when they show up in a Sunday school classroom or a youth group is other kids their age. That's the most important aspect. Free food is second. But nobody goes to a youth group with 4 kids. They just don't want to. They can't hide enough in it. So the advantage of affiliating is that you get more kids at the youth group event. You get more kids at Sunday school. You get more people participating in the pageant. In addition, other people who there aren't enough people of their age, young adults, or even middle-aged people with teenage children. I know that when I was attending church, when my daughter was a teenager, what I needed more than anything, pastorally speaking, was to talk to other parents of teenagers. And my kid was in a youth group, and I was a youth group leader, but I was commiserating with other parents, basically, about what was going on in our lives. So that's the tremendous advantage. The other thing you want to watch out for is clergy burnout, that you don't want clergy basically feeling like they're serving 2 communities as opposed to 1 community. I think it's actually a tremendous opportunity to look at how we can join together and share the gifts of 1 community with the other community. If you're great at outreach and the other one is great at discipleship, think what a gift you could be to one another, to give them opportunities for outreach they never had, to give them access to an EFM program and some other kind of adult formation program that they can't fully set up themselves. It can be a gift.
Can you share with us a specific artwork, a film, a book, a poem, a play, a painting, or piece of music that inspires you? How does this work of art inform your spirituality or theology?
I kept trying not to give this example, but it's the only one God's giving me. I read widely and I play classical music and stuff, but the movie, it's actually a trilogy, but I'll focus on The Godfather 2. It might be because I'm Italian and grew up Catholic, but let me explain why. The Godfather 2 starts with the little boy in Italy, the original Godfather, when he's a little boy, and he's a sweet, good little boy. And his father and then his brother is murdered in front of him. Then he gets swept off to the United States, still a sweet, good little boy. And he grows up, is a nice, sweet, honest man, marries a lovely woman, and then there's a bully, a murderous bully, kind of mafioso guy in Little Italy, in the Bronx, and so he decides to get rid of him in the style he knows how. And I assume you know the whole Godfather. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I focus on this moment because it's a person who's born good and experiences darkness and decides to enter it. If you notice, the Godfather, Don Corleone, has a code of ethics. He believes in being fair and honest and kind and loving until you cross him, and then he's going to get you. And throughout that movie and that series are the sacraments of the church, offering grace, offering help, offering hope. I'm going to jump to 3 now because I can't cover, I'm not going to do the platforming for all 3. But if you remember, one of the last scenes is Michael Corleone, who tried to go good, but sank into evil. Always vengeance. Always vengeance. And in his last moments before he dies, he confesses to a priest, I killed my brother. And the reason this movie touches me so much is that redemption was always near. They always had a chance to reform, and they didn't always make the right decision. Now, as a Christian, I find that moving because, first of all, it reminds me, never choose vengeance, never dwell on anger, always revert back to love and forgiveness and accepting the weakness of others. So it warns me, don't go there. But the presence of the priests, doesn't matter what denomination, the presence of the priest and the sacraments, offering salvation, offering a way to turn oneself over and change anew through generations is always there. And I've watched it, I can't tell you how many times. How many times I've watched it. It's just moving, and it's frankly one of the few ways that a lot of Americans have seen church. It's the only way they get it is through TV and the movies. So it's a great series to show people if they're not coming to church. And it's Italian.
Thank you. No. You can stay, but she wondered how many questions we asked. She said it felt like 3. Next is the Very Reverend Troy Mendez. Troy serves as a dean of the Episcopal Cathedral in Phoenix, Arizona.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you today, this afternoon, and I look very forward to meeting each one of you after we conclude today.
Tell about a time when you have explored the missional opportunities and challenges in the communities you have served. How were you able to leverage parish strengths to engage with and shape missional presence in the wider community?
This is one of my very favorite topics, and I got to tell you why. Let me tell you a story. That when I first went to St. Margaret's Church in Palm Desert, California, that was my second call out of seminary. That is a resort community, very seasonal. People show up in November, they go home in April because it's really hot there in the summer. But it was a big church. In the winter, 1,500 people. And so I had this idea as the associate rector at the time that we were going to do EFM, Education for Ministry, which is these small groups, self-taught modules that people do for 36 weeks out of the year. And I was told, can't be done. No way. No, our people go home, they don't want to do it. Well, after a series of a number of conversations that I had with people who were pretty much year-round residents, I started pulling and cultivating interest in this from the base of the people that were there through the year. And people said, oh, I would like to do that. I need to learn more about reading the Bible. I would really like to know more about theology and how the church has kind of changed how it's thought over many years. And so a group of 6 of them start out, and we were aiming for about 10 to 12 people. That would have been the ideal number. We ended up getting them together, and we started promoting this with the wider church. Well, what happened? People who normally went home at the summer extended their stay at the church in the area for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, just so that they could still be part of that EFM class. And what I have the pleasure of reporting is that was 11 years ago when that began, actually 12 years ago when that began. And that EFM program is still continuing to this day. So when somebody tells you that something can't be done, it certainly can, but it's a matter of identifying the opportunities and the qualities of the properties that people have and what is informing their hearts, what is filling their soul and making them feel that they can come more alive when they're a part of their church community. This is an opportunity. I have worked in ministry contexts. My first 2 ministry contexts were with people in mostly people who were retired. And in those, what I always saw was a willingness to volunteer, a willingness to show up, a willingness to participate. And that is a core strength of congregations that have older populations. Now, my current congregation is much more mixed than that. I have people who are in college. I have people who are young professionals. I have people that, their kids moved out, but they're still living at home. They're thriving in their careers and so on. And then I have people also who are retired. I'm in a downtown congregation, so we have a whole mix of people. And that poses a different set of circumstances because sometimes volunteers, especially during the day, are a little hard to come by. But the fact of the matter is if you really take into perspective and get to know people at their walk of life, where they are, and identify the gifts and talents that they have for ministry, and cultivating a culture, for example, in this diocese, where we recognize the gifts and talents that each person has in ministry so that the church can benefit from each person's individual and unique gifts. This is a culture that can be influenced, that can be developed, that can be shaped in all sorts of ways, but what it takes is that spirit of discernment and that spirit of seeing people exactly who they are, meeting them where they are, and cultivating a community that then recognizes the gifts and talents of each person inside that community.
We have several members of the LGBTQIA plus community in our diocese. Tell us about your work with these communities. What is your commitment to queer advocacy?
Thank you. Well, as somebody who identifies as openly gay, I can tell you that I have quite a bit of experience of this in the church. In fact, I was a bit of a pioneer when I was at Virginia Theological Seminary 16 years ago, because I was in a relationship at the time, and my partner at the time and I we are no longer together, but at that time we were the first gay couple to live in the married student housing. So I have been a bit of a pioneer in this realm for quite a while. My experience with working in fellowship and in ministry with the LGBTQ community in any kind of formal way goes back to my sponsoring parish days at All Saints Beverly Hills, where we had weekly fellowship groups, and we actually did a very intentional class on Christian formation about what does it mean to follow Jesus and identify as someone who is LGBTQ. It was phenomenal. We put an ad in a local paper and had over 120 people show up for the first class. It was revelatory to me as how hungry people are really for the voice of God, for the presence of God in their life. Now, let's fast forward. In my current position as Dean of Trinity Cathedral, one of the very first things I had to do when I was called as dean there in 2013 was I had to go on CNN with Anderson Cooper 6 weeks after I was there. And I got to tell you, I didn't know what I was getting into, because I did not understand the congregational dynamics of my congregation. I did not know the political landscape very well of Arizona. I didn't know a whole lot of things, and I was taking quite a risk. It was all about this religious freedom thing. It had to do concurrently with LGBTQ rights. And so I went on the program and I spoke what I needed to say, and actually had very good feedback overall from the church. But as we pushed that further, what that did was it connected me then in my local community with many different organizations that came to me and said, we want to talk to you. We want to talk about some different things. One of the ones that we did very early on was about anti-bullying campaigns. We did this in English and in Spanish, and we ended up going on, this was the scariest moment I think in my ministry, was going on live Spanish television, speaking Spanish on Univision about an anti-bullying campaign. But it went very well. It was fantastic. I would say that what we've done is, one of the organizations that I've affiliated with recently is an organization called One Community in Arizona. And what we have done, I won an award from them several years ago, but what we have done is we have pushed very hard businesses and churches primarily to sign this thing called a unity pledge. When what it does is it pledges that in your organization that you are going to practice non-discrimination. You are not going to discriminate based on any of the things that the EEOC says, but also that you're not going to discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity. We have now, One Community is the largest coalition of businesses, small businesses, corporations, and churches that now have this in place in Arizona. And through our work of advocacy, we just recently had the new governor of Arizona sign an executive order banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity for anyone that is employed by the state of Arizona or anyone that does business with the state of Arizona. These are very important things that the church has a voice in. The church has a big voice in. And our job is to not only find a community, cultivate that community, and champion the fact that our baptism calls us into respecting the dignity of absolutely every human being and doing everything in our power to make sure that that plays out in the real world as well. Thank you.
Thank you. What new and hopeful perspectives and ideas can you bring to the conversations about church decline that support and encourage long-term solutions?
Well, what I would say is that we talk a lot, we hear this narrative of church decline at times. But I think the other thing that we hear in the news very often that we don't realize is how quickly the world is changing around us. The world is changing in such a way with electronic instant communication, you can communicate with anybody all over the world, that the way that we evangelize and the way that we are formed as Christians will change, that will continue to change. And from that change, we then have to become a church that is different in the future than we are today. This is not a scary task. This is about how we answer Jesus' call. When those disciples were along the Sea of Galilee and they were fishing and Jesus said, "Follow me," they didn't know what they were getting into. They had no idea at all. But they did, and their lives were fundamentally changed for all times. Then we have, let's fast forward in the Bible, the part where the disciples are meeting behind locked doors in John, and then Jesus appears to them. And he breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Well, what does the Bible do with that narrative? Immediately thereafter, the disciples no longer hide behind locked doors ever again. They feel completely free to speak their mind, to say exactly who God is and what God has done for them in their lives. And that is the type of culture that if the Episcopal Church took on a way that we knew how to tell our story in new and unique ways with communication devices and platforms that speak to today's world, we will be just like those disciples. Not only will our lives be changed from now and through all time, but the church will actually be changed as well. We have unlimited opportunities for addressing any of these systems that we look at as the church, and we talk about it in some ways in decline, but I really invite us strongly that we need to talk about it as what are our ministry opportunities and who are we called to be as followers of Jesus in the world right here and right now, because this is a very exciting time that we're living in. We don't have all the answers. We're not supposed to because we're not in charge. God is.
Communication is essential to effective ministry. However, it has been difficult to access clear and prompt avenues of communication, particularly with diocesan staff. Emails go unanswered and resources are tough to access. How would you remedy this communication disconnect and work to establish a diocesan culture of prompt and effective response?
Anytime an organization builds from one layer to another layer to another layer, there are many times that either people get lost in the process or information gets lost in the process. We all know this from when we were kids, because there's that game of telephone that I tell one person, they tell the next person, they tell the next person, and then by the time it gets back to me, that wasn't what I was talking about at all. Communication breakdowns are real. They happen. Organizations that are multi-layered frequently deal with this. This is not uncommon in the corporate world. Anybody who has ever, I used to work for Delta Airlines, and anybody that has ever dealt with airlines during travel messes, and recently we've had quite a few of those, that you know that they don't communicate well either. So nobody does this perfectly. I think we have to realize that first. However, it is imperative as a church that we get this right, because people's lives, people's souls, people's spiritual well-being are essential. They're vital to the church. They're vital to us. And we have to get this right with the way that we design our expectations of one another. One of the things that I would call for as a new bishop is a set of norms, a set of expectations that if a call or an email is coming into the diocesan office, you can expect within blank window of time that your call is going to be answered. because the diocesan offices and the diocesan staff have to be there to promote you. It isn't about promoting them. It's about promoting you directly and helping your ministries thrive in your local churches. And if we don't put in the tools and equip ourselves with the correct resources to be able to do this, we are failing you, and that is not acceptable. And so I would say that what we need to do is have a full evaluation of our communication protocols that are taking place in this diocese and looking at the various electronic resources, phone systems even, that might help us and prompt us to be much more responsive to you in real time, to where you're not waiting on us and you're not wondering if we ever knew that something tragic happened in your congregation, or that you've got a boiler exploding and you've got to get it fixed and you need an insurance claim, or whatever the case may be. The fact of the matter is that the bishop's office needs to respond to you.
We live in a time of great change and transformation as a diocese, with over half of the parishes in our community facing a 5-year window, at the end of which they will not be able to afford full-time clergy. What is your vision for the transformation of our congregation and clergy models of work, witness, and ministry?
Well, the models of work, witness, and ministry that many of us live into were developed about 150 years ago. They really were. I mean, they've changed some because, we can do things at night now that we have electric lights in the church and things like that. But the model in many ways hasn't changed. And it is a time in Christianity that we need to look at this, because we as a church, even as ourselves, we relate to one another now very differently than our ancestors did 100 years ago. When people didn't drive cars all around and go long distances, you typically knew the people in the town that you lived in. You didn't really know people. You might have known somebody who you were related to somewhere else, but it wasn't really likely otherwise. And I think that we have to realize that all of our current structures that we have are things from the past that are going to require us to reevaluate and look at differently. So, for example, with churches that are struggling, that are looking at major paradigm shifts over the next 5 years, the first thing to do is to really look at the spiritual health and well-being of those congregations, and really identifying what is God's call on these people, and asking ourselves as a congregation, what is our purpose in our community? Who are we serving? How are we proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ to others? How are we salt of the earth and light to the world? And figuring that out, putting some things on paper, some ideas about what that might look like for each of us. It will be different for every congregation. But the fact of the matter is that's one place to start. Then doing an assessment of facilities, looking at what are future needs, how are these going to be dealt with, and creating plans and putting solid plans down. This is where we need to go from point A to point B. We have to do this for our own well-being and for the people that come after us. And having a forward look invites us to consider that the Holy Spirit is all around us, is inviting us. The Holy Spirit is inviting us to look ahead, to look beyond what we know, and to see what has not yet been revealed to us. Because God already knows, but we don't. And it is imperative that we create plans for each place, that we create benchmarks, and we look at ourselves and say, okay, if we need to make sure that we are growing at this point from 30 people to 100 people, and we need to come up with some type of plan to look at how we might achieve that. There are so many different ways to go about this, not only from staffing with full and part-time priests, but there are so many other vehicles, through grants, through looking at community partnerships, through even church partnerships with people from other denominations that may want to do the same kind of ministry you're doing in your community. Because if you are doing it and somebody else is doing it and you work together, guess what happens? You start inviting more people into doing that with you. And after a while, they get to know you and they say, we want to be a part of this. We want to know what this Jesus person, who is Jesus? What is this about? We want to change our lives too, because we see that you found some sense of blessing within you that we don't have, and we want that. There isn't a quick fix, and there is no magic bullet. There is no secret pill to making any of this work. But we have to allow ourselves the mental flexibility to be imaginative and to imagine how God calls us into something different. That, when it is different, we will find blessing from it.
Finally, can you share with us a specific artwork, a film, a book, a poem, a play, a painting, or a piece of music that inspires you? And how does this work of art inform your spirituality or theology?
Okay, I'm going to try not to get teary-eyed here. I want to tell you that I thought about this question long and hard, and I can tell you a specific painting that moves me, but paintings are very hard to describe to people if you've never seen the painting. So I want to go here instead. I want to assert that the Sagrada Familia Church in Barcelona is the work of art in this world that inspires me, and I want to tell you why. When I first went to Europe the very first time in 1994, I was very excited. I had taken tons of Spanish classes in college, and I was the first time, my family didn't travel when I was a kid, so I got to go to Europe with a friend of mine who was an architectural history major. That was a very interesting trip. And when we went on that, one of the places we went in Barcelona was this church called the Sagrada Familia that looked like a giant sandcastle. And so we go into this building that has no roof on it yet. That's a shell of a building on the outside with these gargantuan towers all around that symbolize the four gospel evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you didn't have any windows in the building. They were all clear glass at the time. And but it was really interesting because the statues and the figures of all these religious people throughout time and biblical characters, they all were shaped differently and they looked differently, and they invited you to imagine God being present in our world now, not just a long time ago, but God is present with us now. Okay, 1994 is when that happened. Let's fast forward to 4 years ago. I hadn't been back to the Sagrada Familia until 4 years ago. And I went back one summer and I was like, yeah, okay, we'll go see it again. So it had changed because now they charged you to go in. Previously they didn't. But I go in and I step into that church. And at that point, you go into the church. There was a roof over it. And I walk into this room that is just beaming with colors and shapes and religious iconography and design. And I immediately was completely overwhelmed because what it told me was this all happened as I was developing my life from a college student and growing and seeking ordination and living into my ministry. And then here I am in this beautiful building that was blessing the world in ways, the new colors and shapes and the roof. And it gave me this overwhelming sense of how God was caring for me in my life, and how God, that it was this interesting parallel of the fact that, Sagrada Familia in 1994, the placard said that they thought they were running out of money and that they didn't know if they would ever finish it. And now what they say is, we're going to finish this, and we do have the money, but we're not finished yet. We're still going. And I love that, because in my own sense of my faith and my ministry development, it's all about how God has a new chapter, that God turns the page and it's something completely new. I may not know what it is, but God does. And so I leave you with this, that it's like the care and nurture of God has been always very revelatory to me in that building. And I cherish that, and it is something that I will never forget, because God truly does take care of us.
Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce the Reverend Canon Dr. Dina Bartholomew. Canon Cleaver Bartholomew is the canon to the ordinary in the Diocese of Rhode Island.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me as your guest and for making time to be here today.
Tell us about a time when you have explored the missional opportunities and challenges in communities you have served. How were you able to leverage parish strengths to engage with and shape missional presence in the wider community?
One of the gifts that I have been given is the opportunity to participate in the College for Congregational Development and to become a trainer in the college. And one of the things we specialize in is working with churches, both lay and clergy leaders, to develop teams and equip them with a sort of toolbox, or we like to call them lenses, through which you can assess the different strengths and weaknesses and possibilities for mission within a church, and equip the lay leaders and the clergy team in that congregation to adapt this array of tools to use in their particular context, so that they can take advantage of the opportunities that happen in the context where they find themselves. So rather than having some sort of one-size-fits-all opportunity for mission, it really is customizable depending on the context in which you find yourselves. And when I originally began in the college, I was in the Diocese of Central New York, and they sent a team of clergy leaders so that we could learn together, and then we could confer with each other and go out and serve as consultants to other congregations. And now that I'm in the Diocese of Rhode Island, we've provided scholarships for lay leaders and invited clergy leaders who bring teams, and I go with them to the college and serve as a trainer, and we go back and help equip congregations throughout our diocese to be able to discern mission opportunities and to use this array of tools to look at how they might best operate within the parameters of their own community. The other thing I've seen is when I was in the Diocese of Central New York, we worked with the Reverend Dwight Shiley, with whom you may be familiar, who took asset-based community development from the University of Chicago and adapted it into Episcopalianese, so that you didn't have to read the theory in development and apply it to the church. He translated it so that we could learn how to go out into our neighborhoods and ask of the people around us what it is that our neighbors need, and how we could get out of the confines of our own four walls, because honestly, sometimes in the church I would drive by and think, people would never know there's a whole universe going on in there just because they're driving by. And we learn to get out of the confines of our own little universe and interact with our neighbors. And it really taught us to have a much more expansive and responsive view to the needs of our neighbors, including the hunger we didn't know was there in a community that appeared to be well-to-do, but after the 2008 crash, mostly appeared to be well-to-do rather than really was anymore, and had a high degree of shame around that, where they didn't want their neighbors to know they were going hungry to pay the mortgage. So we learned a lot more about our neighbors by being open and vulnerable ourselves. And I think that's one of the important things we need to know, is that if we are going to follow Jesus' command to love God and then love our neighbors as ourselves, we have to get to know our neighbors in order to be able to serve them and respond to them. So Dwight Shiley's work helped us to do that. And we took a number of different sort of creative and responsive mission measures in order to be able to get to know our neighbors and then respond to their needs, which is, I think, what we are always called to do. The other thing we've done is just, of course, we took in prayer requests from all our neighbors and integrated them into our worship services So in addition to the practical aspects, we held them up in a life of faith.
Thank you. We have several members of the LGBTQIA plus community in our diocese. Tell us about your work with these communities and what is your commitment to queer advocacy?
Thank you. Well, in the diocese where I currently serve, about a third of our clergy are LGBTQ. So in Rhode Island, it is normal to encounter clergy couples who are either male and female, or male and male. So it's not an unusual thing. People are welcomed, people are fully integrated as LGBTQ members of the clergy and as lay leaders. We have at least one very well-known trans priest who is well supported and came through the small clergy group that I lead for new clergy. We have at least, I want to say, a dozen rectors who are LGBTQ, or priests in charge, clergy who are in charge of cures. And my history in working with LGBTQ community goes beyond the diocese that I currently serve into other dioceses where I have served, and in my own relationships with friends and colleagues. One of the places that my ministry with LGBTQ people really showed up was in my last youth group, where in a medium-sized church where we had probably 40 young people who were somewhat active in the youth group, we had 5 who were gay or lesbian and 1 who was trans. And they continued to come to church after confirmation class, which is alone in itself practically a miracle, and be engaged in the ministries of the church in ways that were appropriate for them as individuals. And the fact that they felt safe and loved and appreciated in that context tells me that we didn't always get it right, but they knew that they were loved and that we were trying.
What new and hopeful perspectives and ideas can you bring to the conversation about church decline that support and encourage long-term solutions?
Well, one of the things to realize about church decline is to look at the actual information. So we were fortunate enough to have Diana Butler-Bass, who is a church historian and well-known lay leader, come and speak for our diocesan convention, and she reviewed the Pew Research information with us on church decline. And one of the interesting things is when they sorted out mainline churches, which is what the Episcopal Church and the UCC and the Lutherans and Presbyterians are, they saw, surprisingly, remarkably steady numbers, which we weren't expecting, especially among younger people. We often lament not seeing the generation that is right below the baby boomers and the next step down. But there are people who, even if they weren't showing up as regularly as the rest of us would like, still identified themselves with their churches. And still, because we are churches that understand the importance of affirming the full range of humanity, be they male or female or non-binary, be they black or white or Asian or Native American or some other racial or ethnic group, that all God's people are welcomed in our churches and seen and embraced as fully human, to be raised up and celebrated with their unique gifts and talents. Not every church approaches people that way. And much of what we see in church decline is because of 2 things. One, our culture is no longer church-centered. When people used to roll their eyes and lament about soccer and how soccer had interfered with church, I would say, well, when we were growing up, there were Sunday blue laws. That's the reason no one was at soccer, because you weren't allowed to be anywhere on Sunday morning other than church. And when those faded, along with other cultural constructs that supported church, we needed to learn to step up and invite people to church and make it welcoming when they came. And we hadn't learned how to do that. But I am confident that is something we can learn how to do. The Episcopal Church should not be the best kept secret in town. If you have a fabulous restaurant you'd recommend to your friends, you also have a fabulous church you can recommend to your friends. If you have a favorite movie or a book you'd recommend to people, you also have a fabulous church you can recommend to people. We need to be able to learn to be as confident in telling our own stories about how we have encountered God in the place where we worship and serve, as we are when we talk about other things we love. And if that's what we need to do to form disciples, then that's where we start. And we need to learn enough about hospitality, like the church where we are today, who's welcomed us as candidates, to welcome every guest who comes into our doors. And when we can do that, I think decline will be far less. One of the things I used to tell my congregation in the Syracuse area is that one of the more hopeful ways to invite people, a much lower threshold for many Episcopalians and the neighbors they have, is to invite them through the side door. Ask them to come to an event at your church. Ask them to come and help out in a social justice opportunity. Ask them to come and assist in the food pantry, or come to that hymn sing, or be at your potluck supper, because once they meet you and know that they will be welcomed by you, it's a much lower bar to come in for a worship service than it is to come into a worship service cold. The other thing is, if you continue your live streaming opportunities, it means they can come and check you out online before they ever have to show up, which can make them feel much safer about actually coming in person, because it's always a risk for someone new to step through your doors.
Communication is essential to effective ministry. However, it has been difficult to access clear and prompt avenues of communication, particularly with diocesan staff. Emails go unanswered and resources are tough to access. How would you remedy this communication disconnect and work to establish a diocesan culture of prompt and effective response?
Thank you. I serve on a diocesan staff, so I am well acquainted with some of these challenges. So one thing I will note is the appreciation that I have for your diocesan staff and how hard they work. And also that in your communications department, you have done an amazing job of very quickly adapting to online worship and communication during the pandemic and following through the less acute stages of it. Many dioceses were not able to adeptly turn to having online worship as you were here in New Jersey. So rightly so, the emphasis in your communications department these past couple of years has been in your streaming and online communications. But one of the results when you put your emphasis one place is necessarily it isn't other places equally much. So I think one of the things that would really be beneficial is an overhaul of your website. If you have, or would like to, take a look at the website for the Diocese of Texas, which is an enormous diocese. They have readily accessible resources on their website. So if you need to go and look up who you need to talk to, or where you need to find a resource, or how you get that grant, or what the rules are, or who the supply clergy might be, you can find it there. And rather than reinvent how to do that, it could serve as a template for a diocese as large as New Jersey to organize itself in a much more accessible and easy manner, especially for those of us who may not be as tech savvy as the people who usually do the designing, right? For those of us who are just going on to look for the thing we need at the moment. So having a really well-resourced website that's easy to navigate would really help with part of that communications and resource question. The other part to realize is any time that you are trying to be in communication with someone in the diocese, they're trying to do triage about the full-on faucet of email that's coming in at any given time. So we ask you, A, to be patient, and B, to let us know if it's really urgent. So I know in our email we have that red exclamation point for a moment. You know, if you really need to tell me this is important, use that important mark. But also, since I'm the canon to the ordinary, all the clergy and the senior wardens have my personal cell phone and can call me or text me. So they know the difference between it's an email question and I can get to it sometime soon, or it's an email question and it's not urgent, but let me know soon, you know, relatively, that's fine. And then there's the, oh my gosh, need to talk now, or the call. And I respond to all of those, and they know it. So when we had our last hurricane warning, I texted all the clergy of all the churches along the expected path so that there would already be a text waiting in their text chain to respond to me for a check-in once the hurricane hit. And that way, if they needed anything, they knew how to get me right away without having to look for it. And if they didn't, they just checked in and said, we're good. So that was as simple as that. So part of it is setting accessibility and reasonable expectations. And the fact that, as I used to tell my parishioners and now tell the clergy and lay leaders of the diocese, I won't know if you don't tell me, and I always appreciate a gentle reminder. And it is true.
We live in a time of great change and transformation as a diocese, with over half of the parishes in our community facing a 5-year window, at the end of which they will not be able to afford full-time clergy. What is your vision for the transformation of our congregational and clergy models of work, witness, and ministry?
Thank you. So in terms of transformation, if people are actually at the point where they are serious about transformation, not it's a nice thought, right? Well, transformation is like a New Year's resolution. It's always great until you actually have to do the work to make it happen. But if we're serious about transformation, then we need to be honest with each other. And that means building a relationship of openness and trust and candor, of asking people, what is it that you really need and is really essential for you? Because there are churches that would say, well, we have money and what we want is essentially a chaplain until we close. That's a very different thing from we're in a neighborhood where we have a vital ministry but not a lot of income, right? They're in two different places. So we need to be able to have honest conversations about where we are, how much energy we have, what we feel called to do, how we might partner up with neighboring congregations, how we might re-envision ourselves and our ministry. What is essential? And I always come back to what Jesus says. What is the summary of the law? To love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And are we working on those two essential things? And if so, how? And what else can we let go of that may be draining our resources or our energy or getting in our own way? Because if we can lighten our load and let go of some of the things we don't need to be doing, so we can focus on the things we are really called to do, then that will make our path forward clear. If what we really need and can afford is a part-time clergy person who works in partnership with us or in partnership with another congregation, or we need to become a ministry center where we have a clergy person who comes in but doesn't have to spend a lot of time there because it's mostly lay-led, then that's what we do. So there isn't one right-size-fits-all kinds of models for churches that are in decline. But there is the opportunity for open, honest, prayerful discernment and conversation. We had one church that's in my current diocese that came to the bishop and said, you know, we've got about 8 people left and about that much money. And we're thinking we should close. And they had just had a clergy person retire, and they thought this is a good time to just shut it down. And he looked at the neighborhood they were in and said, why don't we try something new? And if it doesn't work, no harm done. And that church is now thriving in its context. It has 30 people on Sunday, which from 8 is a huge transformation, but that's not their primary ministry. They house a huge food program on Saturday mornings. The local fraternity unloads the food trucks, donates fresh milk. They hosted vaccine clinics for the state. They have a clothing closet. They have English as second language classes. They now have a young woman who came to me and said, I came from El Salvador where I was a teacher, and I made my way in Rhode Island through figuring out how to do a teaching assistant certificate. And I want to teach other Spanish-speaking people how to go through that same process so they can use their teaching skills to get jobs as teaching assistants. And we connected her with Dorcas International so that she can start that ministry. So from this place that was ready to shut its doors, it has an entirely new life. You never know.
Finally, can you share with us a specific artwork, that is a film, a book, a poem, a play, or a painting, or a piece of music that inspires you? How does this work of art inform your spirituality or theology?
The one that springs to mind is a poem, and I can recite the very first part of it, but it's too long for me to remember the entire thing, but it's called To Love What Death Can Touch by Yehuda Levi. And it is a poem that says, it is a holy thing to love what death can touch. And it is, I would encourage you to look it up. It was used in the television show, ironically, Godless, where they felt like the territory they were in the West was godless. And it was quoted on NPR as being from that particular show. So I was driving shortly after my mother died. And on NPR, I heard this poem. And I had to pull over on the side of the road, because to me it is profoundly moving. And it is a holy thing, because your love still lives in me, your laugh still lifts me, your light still burns within me. It is a holy thing, a godly thing, to love what death can touch. And it is about the gift of life and the spirit we see in the people that we encounter. And I can tell you that when we started the Blue Christmas service at my church, for all those people whose lives had been touched by death and were grieving in one way or another, this is the poem they asked for year after year, because their lives had been touched by the power of God in the presence of the people they encountered, and they had learned the gift of loving what death can touch.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes this portion of it. Jack, are we going next door? Do we know? I think we're going to the parish hall, which is out in. Oh, they're coming in. Just a few thank yous I want to say before they come in. I want to thank all the members of the Search and the Transition Committee who have gotten us this far. For those of you who are watching online who have stuck with us, we do apologize for the technical difficulties that we encountered in the first part of the session, the best laid plans and all of that. We particularly want to thank the folks here at Ascension and for their gracious hospitality, particularly Father McGuire, the priest in charge, the warden's vestry, and members of the church, with a special thanks to Linda Bale, who coordinated today's hospitality, along with Linda and Andy Amon, Tom McKenna, Janice Pregartner, and others. The next forum session will be tonight at 7 p.m. at Holy Trinity in South River. This forum will be live streamed, hopefully, and recorded. It will also be interpreted live in Spanish at the same time. For those details, I encourage you to visit our website, bishopsearchnj.org. We now invite you to engage in conversation with our panel of candidates. Thank you so much.